I won't dress it up. Berlin in '83 was tired and mean, and so was I. It started like any other operation. Until it didn't. A call came through a line we weren't supposed to be using, a voice I trusted less than the radiator in my flat. Intercept a Hungarian with a lead-wrapped parcel, sealed in GDR tape. Deliver it to nobody. Log nothing. You wouldn't believe me if I told you how calm the room felt. When they said it didn't exist, that we were trained for everything except for that. I believed in paperwork and quiet hallways. I believed in the click of a recorder and the red light. That said it was listening. Back then, the badge just meant you'd lie better the next guy. I took the order anyway. You ever smell fresh paint and think someone's hiding something? Berlin smelled like that for a week. Before I regret saying any of this, hit that like button. Subscribe if this is already making you uncomfortable. And tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is. I like knowing where in the world people still dare to listen to secrets like these. The order was clear, but clarity in Berlin was always a joke. I spent the morning parked in a Volkswagen with bad brakes, staring at the Café Moscow sign flickering in the distance. The Hungarian was scheduled to cross at Friedrichstrasse. They said he'd be carrying a parcel, sealed like a coffin lid, lined, heavy, unmarked. I didn't ask questions. You didn't in those days, not if you wanted to keep your teeth. Still, I wondered why Langley wanted me to handle this instead of one of the younger field officers. Maybe they figured an older man drew less attention, or maybe they knew I was too tired to argue. I watched the crowd spill out of the checkpoint. Families clutched bags, soldiers leaned against walls, and the Hungarian shuffled through like a man late for his own funeral. He carried the package against his chest, sweating despite the cold. The street smelled of diesel and burnt bread from a stall nearby. That detail stayed with me, the mix of life and surveillance. I slipped into the flow of people, close enough to hear his breathing. He never looked back. That was my first warning. Anyone trained or scared always looks back. When he ducked into a tram, I followed. I hated trams. Too many eyes, too few exits. The car rattled, passengers muttering in German, Russian, and that soft Hungarian accent. I positioned myself, 2 rows behind him, scanning for tails. Nothing obvious. Still, I felt it. We used to say, trust no one, like a joke. It wasn't. The package sat on his knees, heavier than it should have been for its size. His hands trembled. He knew what he was carrying, or at least what it meant. I wondered if I'd end up dragging him into an alley, or if he'd collapse before I got the chance. By the time he stepped off at Prenzlauer Allee, night had thickened. Streetlights buzzed, casting pools of sickly yellow. He moved faster now, weaving through side streets. I closed the gap. A car idled on the corner of Volga government plates. 2 men inside smoked without speaking. They weren't amateurs. He noticed them too, because his pace broke into a stumble. For the first time, he glanced back, not at them, at me. That was the second warning. He wasn't scared of the Soviets. He was scared of me. I reached him at the corner, hand brushing the sidearm under my coat. I muttered his name. He froze. For a moment, I thought he'd hand me the parcel, like all this had been rehearsed. Instead, he whispered something in Hungarian too low for the Volga men to hear. I caught one word. Nem. No. Then he shoved the parcel into my chest and bolted down the street. The Volga doors slammed. Men stepped out. My choice was simple. Chase the Hungarian or keep the package. I chose the package. It should have been the end of it. Package secured. Contact vanished. 2 Soviets left cursing in the dark. I walked away calm, as if I'd just finished a bad cup of coffee. But the lead wrapping burned cold through my coat and I couldn't shake the thought. Why would he run from me when the real danger was right behind him? The parcel sat on my desk like an unwanted guest. I didn't open it, not yet. Lead-wrapped boxes didn't invite curiosity, they warned against it. Instead, I filed the paperwork nobody would ever read and waited for the next directive. It came sooner than expected. An intercepted call, routed through a frequency no one had touched since the late 60s. A ghost channel. Whoever used it wanted us to know, but not too many of us. I listened to the tape in a smoke-stained room above the station. Two voices, Russian. Calm, technical. They weren't trading gossip. They were laying coordinates, precise, deliberate, leading straight to a bunker outside Leipzig. The words they used weren't civilian. Not shipment, not supplies. They said unit, deployment, field test. That was military language, the kind you only used when you knew somebody else was listening. It wasn't a slip. It was bait. Still, it worked. Within hours, Berlin lit up with chatter. Our side scrambled assets. Their side did the same. I made a note. Both nets active. What that really meant was simple. We were no longer observers. We were participants. I asked Langley for clarification. The Pentagon's answer was quick and cold. No such technology existed, therefore nothing could be stolen. I almost laughed. I'd been in the game long enough to know denial was its own kind of confirmation. One night later, I found myself hunched over a radio set older than me, tuning back to the same frequency. Static, then a pulse. Not a voice this time, but a pattern. Like someone tapping on a coffin lid. 4 short bursts, a pause, then 3 long. Morse stripped down to bones. I jotted it in my notebook, though I already knew the translation. Ready soon. My stomach turned, not from fear, but from recognition. I'd seen that phrasing in a briefing from '75, a program scrubbing before it saw daylight. The ink on that file wasn't even dry when they buried it. Yet here it was, humming back at me from Leipzig. I carried the notebook to the chief of station. He skimmed the page, barely looking up. Coincidence, he said, tossing it back like yesterday's. Paper. Coincidence, sure. But he was already sweating through his shirt. That told me more than his words ever could. We both knew what the Soviets were circling. Something that wasn't supposed to survive beyond prototypes. Something Washington swore had never left the drawing board. Walking back through the icy Berlin night, I thought about the Hungarian and his package. He'd shoved it at me like it was poison, not treasure. Maybe he believed the Soviets would take it anyway, or maybe he knew that the Americans wanted them to. Either way, the signal from Moscow didn't just confirm they were moving pieces. It confirmed we weren't the only ones feeding them the board. That should have been the end of it. But then the radio pulsed again. Same pattern, same promise. Only this time, it used our call signs. I waited a week before they gave me clearance to move. Surveillance, coded reports, dead drops, it all blurred together until the night they told me to intercept the Hungarian's package. Only this time, it wasn't in his hands. It had been passed along twice, through couriers who didn't know each other's names. I caught it on the third link. A tired young man in a gray coat, more student than operative, waiting by the tram line with the box on his lap like it was groceries. I approached slowly, careful not to spook him. He didn't resist. He didn't even speak. Just placed the parcel in my arms and walked away without a backward glance. That silence told me he'd been told not to ask questions, same as me. Only difference was, I didn't listen. Back at the safe flat, I unwrapped the layers. Lead lining, heavy as expected. Inside, a steel case about the size of a shoebox. 12 kilos exactly. No markings. I cracked the latch with gloved hands. The air inside smelled metallic, sharp. Nestled in foam was a capsule, cylindrical, dull gray. No insignia, no warnings. But I knew what it was. Or at least, what it shouldn't be. It looked harmless enough until I noticed the faint etching near the base. A series of numbers and letters I recognized instantly. Langley, mid-70s. I'd seen those same codes stamped on blueprint. Drafts marked classified canceled project. Back then, they called it a prototype. Then they buried it. The Pentagon insisted the design was shelved, destroyed. But here it was, humming quietly under my fingertips. I sat there, staring at it, under the dim bulb, wondering how it had crawled out of our archives and into Soviet hands. The capsule contained a mixture of isotopes unstable, yes, but with the right trigger, it could power something far more dangerous than a light bulb. It wasn't a bomb in itself. It was worse. It was potential. My first thought was anger at Langley, at the Pentagon, at the whole machine that had sworn this technology never existed. My second thought was practical. Who had fed it to them? Because the Soviets couldn't have built it from scratch. They didn't think in those lines. This was American engineering, pure and uncut. I placed the capsule back in its case and rewrapped it in the lid. The glow of the bulb overhead flickered once, like the room itself didn't want me to see more. I laughed, short and bitter. We used to joke about ghosts in the walls. That night, I almost believed it. I should have reported it immediately, filed it away, handed it over to the faceless men who would smother it under red tape. Instead, I kept it close, waiting for the right moment. Because deep down, I already knew the ugly truth. If I turned it in, it would disappear again. And so would I. Oh, in that moment, I couldn't have guessed that opening the box was the least dangerous choice I'd made all week. I started looking over my shoulder more than usual, and in Berlin, that meant something. Every street already had too many shadows, but this was different. Every time I walked back from the station, I felt the same eyes, never too close, never sloppy. Whoever it was had training. Inside the CIA's Berlin outpost, things weren't cleaner. Files that should have been locked were suddenly circulating in the wrong hands. A report I'd drafted about the Hungarian, about the package, came back to me with sections blacked out before I'd even sent it up the line. That was the first crack in the mirror. Someone inside wasn't just leaking. They were editing reality. I started testing colleagues the way you'd test a fence for weak points. Casual comments, false leads. One junior officer repeated my lie. Within 2 days, word for word, in a place he couldn't have known about. Which meant somebody was pulling strings above his pay grade. It wasn't sloppiness. It was intent. The Soviets began showing up where they shouldn't. A surveillance post I'd set up in Friedrichshain was compromised within hours. A Stasi officer I trusted said nothing directly, just pressed a cigarette into my hand and muttered, "Check your own house." He didn't need to say more. By then, I was living in 2 Berlins, the one outside divided by concrete and checkpoints, and the one inside fractured by betrayal. Protecting the capsule no longer felt like a mission. It felt like survival. Because if they knew what I was holding, then they also knew who was holding it. And in Berlin, 83, that meant the clock was already ticking. What unsettled me most wasn't the Soviets waiting across the wall. It was realizing the deadliest pair of eyes on me wore the same badge I did. It was a paper trail that gave him away, as it usually does. Not gunfire, not some cinematic chase. Just the smell of old ink and the weight of a file nobody wanted me to find. I spent nights combing through requisition logs, requests for classified access, the sort of paperwork that never lies unless someone teaches it to. One name kept surfacing: Dwight H., technical analyst, the kind of man who spoke in acronyms and numbers, not whispers. His record looked clean until you traced the edges. Retired in the early 70s for what they politely called emotional instability. That was bureaucratic shorthand for we don't trust him, but we can. Prove why. Except the trail didn't end there. Vienna, 1978 consultant work under a civilian contract. Then nothing. Disappeared from the rolls in 81 like he'd stepped off the planet. Except now, in 83, his name was stamped on an access slip attached to my case. I remember sitting, alone in the records room, the hum of fluorescent lights above, staring at his signature. My gut tightened. Bureaucrats don't rise from the dead unless someone wants them to. If Dwight was back in play, it wasn't by accident. I pulled everything I could: memos, redacted cables, even a photograph buried in a personnel folder. He looked ordinary enough. Thinning hair, glasses too big for his face, a kind of man you'd ignore at a train station. But I'd seen men like him before. They were the most dangerous. The ones who vanished in plain sight, not the next day. A contact. In Vienna confirmed what I already feared. Dwight had been spotted there months earlier, meeting with intermediaries no one could pin down. No official capacity, no formal clearance. Just a ghost with old credentials, moving like he still belonged. That night, I sat with a bottle of schnapps and the case still hidden under my floorboards. Every thread pointed back to him. The Soviets weren't ahead of us by luck. They were being fed, spoon by spoon, by someone who once swore the same oaths I did. The ugly part was realizing it wasn't just about theft. It was orchestration. I should have stopped digging then. Should have passed the file upward, let Langley bury it under a mountain of denials. Instead, I marked his name in my notebook, underlined twice. Dwight H. A man the system had written off, but who now pulled strings strong enough to choke Berlin. And that's when I understood. The real danger wasn't the weapon in my possession. It was the traitor who knew exactly where it came from and where it was going next. The Stasi man owed me, though he'd never admit it. Years earlier, I'd covered for his botched surveillance job, and debts like that linger. When I called, he didn't hesitate. He told me to meet him near Nordbahnhof. No uniform, no insignia. Just two old men pretending to take a walk in the eye. Wrong part of the city. He led me through a rusted gate and down a stairwell that smelled of damp concrete and mold. The tunnels beneath the station were cold enough to bite through my coat. He lit the way with a weak flashlight, its beam cutting across pipes and graffiti left by kids who thought they were immortal. At the end of the corridor, a heavy iron door stood ajar. Inside was a vault, lined with shelves that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Crates marked Beschlagnahmt, confiscated. Radios, cameras, boxes sealed with Soviet tape. And then, on a central table, the reason he'd brought me. A small container, cleaner than everything else around it. It pulsed faintly, not with light, but with presence. I opened it carefully. Nestled inside was a compact energy cell, far beyond what either East or West claimed to control. I froze. I'd seen sketches of it once in a classified briefing, 1975. Back then, it was dismissed as impractical, too unstable for field use. Now here it was, sitting in a damp Berlin basement under Stasi custody. The man beside me didn't say a word. He didn't need to. We both understood the implication. This wasn't theft, it was recycling. Secrets the Americans buried were resurfacing in East German vaults, polished and prepared. Somebody had traded more than just blueprints. I ran a hand over the casing, feeling the vibration through my glove. It wasn't imagination. It was alive in its own way, a hum that shouldn't exist outside a Langley lab. The walls seemed to press closer as I realized what I was touching. Proof that both sides were playing the same dirty game. I shut the lid, forced my face blank, and handed it back across the table. My contact's eyes met mine, heavy with something between warning and pity. Neither of us spoke on the walk back to the surface. The city noises hit hard when we emerged, like surfacing from deep water. That night, lying awake in my flat, I couldn't shake the truth. The Soviets hadn't stolen our weapon. We'd handed them the pieces. And Berlin was just the warehouse dot. I kept turning the pieces over in my head. The capsule, the energy cell, Dwight's ghost signature. None of it fit until someone whispered a name I hadn't heard before: Panoptico. No file, no clearance code, just a word muttered like a curse in the back hallways of the station. I pressed harder, and the edges began to show. Panoptico wasn't a Soviet project. It wasn't even strictly ours. It was something else, an experiment buried under overlapping jurisdictions, funded in fragments, so no committee ever saw the whole picture. The capsule I held wasn't a prototype by itself. It was a piece of a larger weapon, a portable electromagnetic pulse device. Crude, unstable, but real enough to kill communication lines without firing a shot. The more I dug, the more it became clear that both sides were circling the same prize. Reports crossed my desk with timestamps that didn't add up, surveillance photos stamped with markings from both archives. Someone was orchestrating the leaks, making sure Panoptico lived in the shadows between East and West. One night, I tested the capsule in a safe flat. Just a diagnostic, nothing more. The lights flickered. The tape recorder on my desk jammed mid-sentence, ribbon curling like it was being strangled. My watch stopped dead. I sat there in the sudden silence, realizing I'd just confirmed the impossible. It worked. After that, I wasn't alone. Cars I didn't recognize parked outside my building, engines running long after midnight. Phone clicks returned, subtle but unmistakable. Even my colleagues kept their distance, as if they already knew. The crosshairs had widened. I wrote a memo detailing everything: coordinates, cell structure, proof of function. I sent it up the chain. 3 days later, the same memo came back to me, stripped of every detail except the title. Someone had erased my words and left only a placeholder. Panoptico didn't officially exist, which meant it could live forever. Standing on the balcony of my flat, Berlin cold gnawing through my bones, I understood the trap. This wasn't theft. It wasn't counterintelligence. It was theater. A stage where both sides pretended to hunt each other, while the real script was written elsewhere. And for the first time, I wondered if my role was investigator or just another actor hitting his marks on cue. Helga never wasted words. When she asked to meet in Potsdam, I knew it mattered. She arrived in her usual gray coat, a scarf wrapped twice around her neck, carrying a folder thick enough to weigh on her arm. She didn't sit right away, just placed the dossier between us on the cafe table and stared until I opened it. Inside were photographs, typed reports, and field notes that didn't belong in civilian hands. The first pages described an unexplained blackout in Ukraine, 1982. Officially, the power grid had failed. Helga's documents told a different story. A controlled detonation of energy, silent and localized, leaving no scorch marks, no blast radius. Just darkness. For hours. Buried deeper were casualty notes: 12 operatives dead, not from burns or shrapnel, from failure of every electronic system they carried. Radios, watches, pacemakers, all dead at once. The report said environmental anomaly. Helga whispered the truth. It was a test. Panoptico had already been deployed. I flipped through more pages. Schematics sketched by engineers I recognized. Men who'd worked in Virginia before they were quietly reassigned eastward. Some pages even bore Pentagon stamps, poorly erased, but still visible under the right light. My throat tightened. These weren't stolen designs. They were shared, traded like currency between enemies who smiled for cameras while they're scientists. Swapped notes underground dot. Helga sat across from me, her hands folded tight. "They'll bury this too," she said softly, as if already resigned. She wasn't asking me to believe her. She was showing me what she'd risked her life to deliver. I believed every word. I closed the folder and slid it back. She shook her head, pushing it toward me again. "Keep it. They already know I spoke to you." A simple sentence, delivered like a verdict. We parted on the street, her figure vanishing into the crowd as if she'd never been there. I tucked the folder under my arm, its weight heavier than the capsule hidden in my flat. One was technology. The other was proof. Proof that the silence in Washington wasn't ignorance. It was intent. That night, I locked both in the same place. And for the first time since this began, I realized the Soviets weren't testing our resolve. We were testing theirs. And Helga had just handed me the evidence no report would ever admit existed. The summons came on a scrap of paper slipped under my door. No signature, no code, just an address. A church east of Kreuzberg, abandoned since the 60s. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something in the handwriting made me pause steady, deliberate, like a man who'd written more classified reports than grocery lists. I went at night, coat collar turned up, pistol heavy under my arm. The church smelled of mildew and ash, its stained glass windows long shattered. Candles flickered on the altar, the only light in the cavernous hall. And then I heard the voice. A voice I hadn't heard in 10 years, belonging to a colleague I'd buried in my memory as dead. He stepped out of the shadows, older, thinner, but unmistakable. We didn't embrace. We didn't even smile. He simply handed me a folder and said, "You were never meant to carry this alone." Inside were documents that chilled me more than the cold stone walls. It wasn't the Soviets who had stolen Panoptico. It wasn't even Dwight acting on his own. The leak had been deliberate, sanctioned by a faction inside our own government. The logic was brutal. Balance. If both sides had the weapon, neither could use it first. At least, that was the theory. I wanted to argue, to demand who had decided this was worth the risk. But my colleague's eyes told me the answer. Men in suits, faceless, shielded by committees that would never bear the blame. He lowered his voice. We didn't fail to stop them. We helped them. The silence after those words pressed heavier than the walls. My mind raced back to the Hungarian, to Helga, to every odd omission in the reports. It all fit, horribly neat. The real betrayal wasn't across the wall. It was written into our own playbook. When I asked why he'd told me, he shrugged, almost amused. Because you still think you're playing the old game. And someone should know how it really ended. Then he blew out the candles, plunging the church into black. I stood there a long time, folder in hand, hearing the echo of his footsteps fade. For once, Berlin's night air felt almost honest compared to what I carried back out into the streets. Back in Langley, the air felt thicker than Berlin's winter. The capsule and Helga's dossier were sealed in a courier pouch, marked urgent, hand-delivered to headquarters. I expected interrogation, questions, maybe even handcuffs. Instead, I got silence. The first debrief lasted 15 minutes. A junior officer sat across from me, eyes glazed, jotting notes without looking up. Every time I mentioned Panoptico, his pen slowed, as if deciding whether to write the word at all. When I pressed, he cleared his throat and said, "That term doesn't exist in our system." He wasn't lying. It had already been erased. The second meeting was shorter. A panel of 3, none I recognized. They asked if I still had the capsule. I told them it was in their vault now. One of them smiled faintly, as though I'd confirmed exactly what they needed. Then they dismissed me without another question. Days later, I checked the archives. My report wasn't logged. The pouch was missing from the chain of custody ledger. The official story read, "No material recovered." I was reassigned within a week, shuffled out of Berlin with no explanation. On paper, it looked like a promotion. In reality, it was exile. I tried once more to raise it, speaking to a senior I'd known for years. He held my gaze a long time before saying, "Some things aren't meant to be written." Then he walked away, leaving me in a corridor that suddenly felt colder than any alley in the East. That was the verdict. No trial, no defense, just silence. The kind of silence that folds around you like a shroud. Panoptico had been buried again, not by enemies, but by the very hands sworn to guard against it. And as I left the building, a thought lodged in me like shrapnel. In this war, truth didn't get erased by bullets. It drowned in paperwork signed, stamped, and filed where no one would ever look. Berlin had a way of swallowing people, but this time it was too clean to be chance. Within weeks, Helga was gone. Her apartment stripped bare, furniture left, but papers burned in the sink. Neighbors said she'd moved suddenly. I didn't believe them. Informants don't relocate without a trace. They vanish when someone makes. It so got the contact in Leipzig fared worse. Picked up for currency violations. Dead in a cell 3 days later. The official cause, heart failure. I'd seen him 2 weeks before healthy, alert. The Soviets didn't even bother hiding the message. If you talk, you disappear. The capsule itself, what I thought was proof, was never logged again after I turned it over. I checked manifests, vault entries, transfer slips, all blank. It was as though it had never existed. The only evidence left was a faint smear of radiation in the safe flat where I'd first opened it, detected by a Geiger counter. I borrowed against orders. Invisible, inaudible, undeniable. My own file changed too. References to the operation disappeared. Commendations evaporated. It was like someone had decided I'd served in Berlin. Yes, but never in that capacity, never on that mission. My name and the truth were divorced by red ink. Nights in my reassigned post, I kept going back over it. Not the science, not the strategy, the people. Helga's steady eyes across a cafe table. The Hungarian's desperate shove of the parcel into my chest. Dwight's signature on a file he shouldn't have touched. Each erased in turn, one by one, until only I remembered. That was the price. Silence written into official history, louder than any gunshot. We used to joke that spies died twice, once in life, once in the archives. I hadn't died yet, but my story already had. And in that silence, the question pressed harder every night. If none of it was real on paper, then what was left of me? Now it's just me in the Vermont woods, a cabin too quiet for a man who spent decades listening through walls. I sit by the stove some nights, replaying that year in Berlin like a broken reel. The capsule, the dossiers, Helga's voice. They loop sharper than the wind outside. I don't tell the neighbors what I used to be. They wouldn't believe it anyway. The truth that keeps me awake isn't that the Soviets stole our weapon. It's that we gave it to them. Piece by piece, under the table, sanctioned by men whose names will never be spoken outside sealed rooms. They didn't wear uniforms or medals. They wore suits, carried briefcases, and spoke of balance while handing the other side the very thing we were told to protect. I used to think betrayal looked like a defector crossing the wall. Now, I know better. Betrayal was stamped, signed, and carried out under our own seal. We weren't victims, we were accomplices, some knowing, some blind. I was just the unlucky bastard who saw enough to understand, but not enough to change it. So here I am, older, slower, waiting out the years with memories that don't match any archive. Some nights, I almost convince myself It was just another Cold War rumor. Then I remember the weight of that lead box in my arms. Heavier than 12 kilos should have been. Real, undeniable, and erased. Not all enemies carried rifles. Some carried pens, and they won without firing a shot. I never told anyone the whole story, not in one piece. They took the capsule, they buried the files, and they erased the names mine included. What's left are fragments. A tram rattling through Berlin, Helga's scarf disappearing into a crowd, the hum of a device that shouldn't have existed. I carry them the way you carry old scars. You forget they're there until the weather changes. When I turn off the lights at night, the cabin settles into silence. Sometimes I think I hear that same faint pulse, like the capsule still hidden under the floorboards, though I know it's gone. Maybe that's the part they couldn't scrub. Memory. You can burn paper, seal vaults, kill witnesses, but you can't erase what a man remembers. And me? I remember enough to know the Cold War never ended. It just changed uniforms.